root causes of this kind of anti-Asian violence that we've been seeing recently. This month, March 2022, marks the 2-year anniversary of living under the COVID-19 pandemic for those of us in the US. This means that for 2 years, we've not only been living with this pandemic, we've been living with this escalated propaganda assault against China that's come with it. Last week, March 16th, marked the 1-year anniversary of the Atlanta spa shootings, in which a 21-year-old man went on a shooting spree in Atlanta across 3 massage parlors and killed 8 people, 6 of whom were Asian women. Here in New York City right now, we are experiencing an unspoken crisis of brutal assaults on people of Asian descent. Women and the elderly have been particularly vulnerable. In Yonkers last week, a 67-year-old Asian woman was knocked to the ground and punched 125 times. A couple of weeks ago, a 28-year-old was arrested for perpetrating a string of attacks on 7 different Asian women in the span of only 2 hours. In each of these assaults, there was no prior interaction. He just walked up to each one and punched them without provocation. In January, a 40-year-old Asian woman named Michelle Go was shoved onto the subway tracks. In November, 61-year-old Gu Yingma was sweeping her sidewalk in Queens when a man, completely unprovoked, violently attacked her, beating the side of her head with a rock. This permanently damaged the right side of her brain and left her in a coma hooked up to a ventilator and feeding tube. She died from her injuries earlier this month. And of course, just a few weeks ago, in this neighborhood, 35-year-old Korean American Christina Yuna Lee was murdered in her Chinatown apartment in this neighborhood. She had taken a taxi home late at night at 4 in the morning, and a man followed her into her building. He followed her up the stairs and into her apartment, where he sexually assaulted her and stabbed her over 40 times. Now, these are just a few recent incidents in New York City alone, but there's so many more, and there's not really any time, there's not enough time for me to recount each one. Now, these are acts of racist and sexist violence, but there's a resistance among Americans to even admit that. After the Atlanta shootings, both cops and the shooter denied race was a motivating factor, instead claiming he had a sex addiction and just wanted to eliminate temptation. There's a reason the shooter targeted Asian women specifically, just like there's a reason Christina Yuna Lee was targeted, and there's a reason why on the subway platform, the man who pushed Michelle Go onto the tracks ran past everyone else and chose to target her. People also seem to be in denial that this propaganda war against China is fueling these attacks on Asian people. They argue that there's no evidence that this escalating anti-China media coverage led to, for example, the murder of Christina Yuna Lee. They seem to think that when we argue for that being the case, we're arguing that a direct link exists, like Christina's murderer read a Washington Post article or an Atlantic Council report on the rise of China, and that's what led him to kill her. This is obviously not what we're saying. The link is not that direct. What we mean is this kind of anti-China new Cold War coverage contributes to an already existing atmosphere where Chinese and Asian people have historically been dehumanized in Americans' minds, making them more vulnerable to violent attacks. And you cannot divorce racism here from US policy abroad and its history in Asia. This new Cold War on China is the latest manifestation of this imperialist history and the US desire for total military dominance in the Asia Pacific. During the Korean War, the US dropped 635,000 tons of bombs over the Korean Peninsula. They completely leveled Korea. Between 1965 and 1975, the US dropped more than 7.5 million tons of bombs over Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, double the amount dropped on Europe and Asia during World War II. And also from 1964 to 73, the US dropped 2 million tons of bombs over Laos alone, making it the most heavily bombed country in history. Now you have to dehumanize people first in order to kill them so recklessly, right? And so you can draw a direct link from Western imperialism to the popular image of this fetishized, submissive, hypersexualized Asian woman. These wars in Korea, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia destroyed entire villages, destroyed entire cities, destroyed economies, killed family members, and forced the women in those countries into a sex work industry serving American soldiers. This is the basis of our popular perception of Asian women. Imperialism has made the image of the Asian woman to serve its own needs. Submissive and hardworking, often hypersexualized, whose own life is cheap and disposable. This is what makes us prime targets for street violence. As Nahir said just a few minutes ago, our labor is cheap, it's always devalued. Entire industries are built on this tacit assumption of Asian women's disposability and devaluation. From the military sex work industry, to the sweatshop garment industry, to the domestic care industry. All of these industries, which are often rife with abuse and exploitation, rely on a largely Asian women workforce. And just like the policies of its war on terror made Arab Americans here more vulnerable to racist attacks, the escalation of the new Cold War on China is directly related to the sharp rise in anti-Asian assaults we've seen. We cannot expect racist propaganda for imperialist posturing to not have an effect on Asian American lives. We cannot expect a continuation of the American tradition of the dehumanizing of Asian women will not lead to an attack on us. We cannot simply expect, because the U.S. is targeting China, racists will know or care about the distinction and not target other Asian people. An attack against Asian people abroad is an attack against people of Asian descent at home. Our response should be clear and simple. No to the propaganda war on China. End to the U.S. military-industrial complex. Thank you.